Hey everyone, we're going to get the next debate started. A little explanation of the way you can help us keep it going. When we're going to have a timer up, and the speakers are on strict time limits, and when we get to about 20 seconds, if we could start to let them know that they're really running out of time by snapping our fingers or rubbing them together. If we all do it together, it's a really nice sound. And when they run out of time, we all applaud, which then tells them that they're out of time in a really nice way, and they'll stop. The speakers, I will have notes by me where you can see how much time is left, so you don't have to turn. Well, I'll put up a 5 and a 2 and a 1.
Yeah. No, finally we go with the mic like that.
Okay, so someone else.
I'm gonna hold it.
Yeah.
So I believe the affirmative position will be that we need sustainability in open source free software, correct? Sustainability initiatives, right? Is that what you're? Right. And you're taking the affirmative. It does need sustainability. Okay, and with that, we'll do the first affirmative.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Are we good?
Okay.
Yeah, who can hear me? Okay, you were eating, right? It's fine. So, does free open source software need sustainability? Yes. We're done, right? We're done. No, but actually the question is a little bit more deep than that, right? What kind of sustainability free and open source software needs is maybe the real question behind that, right? Because we already have a kind of sustainability for many projects, right? We have many models, many things that works okay, but there may be time for some improvements, right? And the debate here is about what could be these improvements, right? But first we need to remind what is open source, right? We have only 7 minutes, right? But the idea behind that is open source just a legal framework for copyright? Or it's a movement, a model, a societal idea, right, that we try to defend, right? A non-rival society where things reproduce into the commons, right? What sustainability model we need for that definition, right? It's also because humans, open source, like every human construction, is made by humans. Humans are weak. Humans change their mind when money comes. Humans are lazy. And humans die, right? So how we can achieve sustainability over all these human things, right? How we can have this transcendental idea that continues from the one who were before us and continues for the one after us, right? So that's the first thing. So we need better open source software sustainability, and I will define 5 points quickly. 5 points for these new models, right? 5 minutes, 5 points. It's great. The first one is the idea, how we can sustain the idea of sustainability in open source software, right? The open source software definition is the first step, but how we can sustain it more? How we can educate more people to know it, to educate them, to defend them in their communities, but also how we can contribute to it, to sometimes a model of how it has been decided that was not as contributive as it could be today. How we can open source the open source definition, right, to make it sustainable with today's society, right? That's the first step. The second, we need to understand that fire, we need to keep it alive, right? And so maybe we need to open it. The second thing is the people, right? How many developers are in burnout because they have been completely burned at the fire of the open source software idea, right? How many projects are sustained on the global level, but destroyed health and lives of the lone maintainers in each of them? On 20 years, yeah, it's sustainable, but how many casualties we have seen in all of these projects, right? So we need to define also a global sustainability model and also a sustainability model for the individual, right? That is there, right? The third thing is the law infrastructure, right? How we can have sustainable license, which are not the sustainable license we talked about, that we close the software to sustain it, but sustainable license that will keep open source software forever, as I call it, free and always free open source software, right? That's different. The promise that we make it open will stay forever, right? You know, and so we need to keep that infrastructure, that law infrastructure, sane enough to have this living, right? To be able to always innovate in terms of law, right? but also to be able to be adapted depending on the project. So let's see how that can work together. The fourth is the money, right? We'll talk later about that in the second affirmative panel. But yeah, we need sustainable funding, right? And again, this system, it works right now. It works for many projects. But how we can have a sustainability funding model that is not based on few corporations deciding to fund money for organization, to fund some project they decide for their own interest, right? So that's my fifth point. How we can apply all these first four models into a more independent software developer in open source model, right? How we can apply all these things, money, laws, and infrastructure, ideas, and people to enable them to develop, an independent model based on all the first things, right? That will enable to leave from the software they build because people build it, people use it afterwards. The solution to that really mix the economical impact with what people produce. So it's not just sponsoring, deciding what, like in French we call the kings decide, right? The kings decide who they fund, right? But no, like it's really matching the users and the producers, right? So these 5 models define what maybe the better sustainability, right? I will just finish. How long do I have? 2 more minutes. I'll just finish by saying that to compare to environment, right? Just imagine we ask, does environment needs to sustainability, right? It's obvious it's yes, right? It's our living environment. If we want to live in a world where open source software brings value in our society, of course it needs sustainability, right? But it needs better ones, better than we have right now. We need to make sustainability costs go down to 0 at maximum, right? To enable more projects to be sustainable. I will just get that quote from a famous ecologist. He say, we don't inherit from the word from our parents, but we just borrow the word from our children, right? It should be the same for open source software, right? Sustainability over generations, right? Based on the 5 principles I shared earlier, right? And so for the people who think I'm a utopist, right? I've made 2 companies that are profitable. I've done many things. I organize tech conferences. I'm a utopist with a business model, right? So it's possible, and it's possible, and you will see in the second affirmative section that it's possible to have a better sustainability models for open source software. Thank you very much.
So by mutual agreement of both debate teams, a neutral party will be doing all the cross-examination. So I'm handing that to Miriam.
Thank you. So I actually have 2 questions for you. First question, you said keep the fire burning, right? So people are really enthusiastic about it. And, we want to keep that up. At the same time, you're proposing a system which means that we need external input to keep the fire burning. Doesn't that actually mean the open source community needs life support?
So your question is like, does open source community need life support?
Yeah.
Let's say that.
Or doesn't your system mean that the open source community needs life support?
So I think I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying that open source communities need more independent source of funding. Let's say if we could talk about funding, for example, more independent source of funding, and at maximum tied to the usage of their software. So if we tie with the usage of the software, and again, there are ways to do that, right? Mm-hmm. But if we tie it with the usage of the software and we find a model, there are many models possible, right? Mm-hmm. We can have independent funding or community-based funding or user-based funding, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about copyright here, just to say, so everybody knows, right? But yeah, so that would avoid this life support thing, because for me, the life support is people who with money, sometimes with models who are not open source, but they make a foundation which has money, and then they decide to life support or not this kind of project.
Okay. So I was going to ask you a second question. I'm going to ask you a different question that I actually intended for Louis, but because it fits now. So, but how is that system then different from a proprietary license? I understand what you're saying is that you don't get the license free from the entity using the software. You get it from someone else. But doesn't that actually mean you still need to pay for the license somewhere, and it's actually not being paid by those who use it? How do you tie it to the use?
So just an example, I didn't want to talk about it here directly, but you asked me the question, you attended to Louis. So just an example, trademark, right? You can you can make people pay for trademark goodwill of a software. So it's not copyright, it's just trademark, right? A company applies your trademark onto a commercial brochure, right? It's not copyright here. But then they make money out of your trademark goodwill, right? And so they can say, oh, actually we use your community, what your community brought to the system, right? The trust represented into the trademark, right? And so now we can pay you because we make millions out of you. Not copyright, trademark. Not intelligence, the swag. That's an option. Thank you.
So now we'll have the first negative, and which you was doing that? Okay, so can you use that mic? And then give us to Miriam.
One, two.
We'll have 7 minutes for the first negative.
All right. So, my friends, this all sounds very jolly, but I'm making the gift of free and open code to you, and I think you shouldn't look into the gifted horse mouth. You are demanding sustainability, but I think we don't need that kind of sustainability. And in particular, there's eventually some kind of emerging military-industrial complex of sustaining or so-called sustaining organization. And that would cover non-profits, such as the Software Freedom Conservancy, the Free Software Foundation that demands that you assign their copyrights to them, as well as for-profit or non-profit 501c6 consortiums, which are conglomerates of companies, such as the Linux Foundation, the Open Collective, and seminars. All of these are kind of a parasite organization which are trying to skim and take their cut on top of your work. Anywhere between 10 to 20%, sometimes trying to lure you, saying they won't take any cut on top of the funding that's duly yours for a period of time. So I think we really don't want nor need this kind of sustainability. That's my first argument. The other thing is that, again, free and open source software is a gift. By injecting sustainability requirements, which is your own mandate, it's not mine. I made a gift, and you want me to sustain that gift forever. I don't think that's a fair demand on your side. You're also turning free and open source software developers, which are volunteers, into some kind of hired guns. You know, they want to sustain. So you're saying the emergence of a software project that really demand funding to be able to achieve anything, which is contrary to everything I believe are the ethos of free and open source software. I already mentioned the notion of this emerging notion of so-called sustaining organization. In the end, they're really brand thinking of sorts, and they're trying to make sure that not only they take a cut on top of your funding, but they're trying to get that forever by luring you in their organization. Worse than that, some of your users, large corporations, may actually demand that you join these organizations in order to use your software. There's another argument that can be made that in the end, when you also fund organizations, fund projects, and it's really the ones that are the best are seeking grants that are eventually able to get the money. So you may end up sustaining projects which really don't deserve it. And you see, I won't point in fingers to anyone, there are really crappy code and crappy projects that are heavily funded. And that's not fair, right? The best code the one that produced the best code may not be the one that are the best at seeking grants and the best at marketing there. And in the end, you could even make an argument that somehow the way FOSS, free software, free and open source software, is really equivalent to diamond, oils, and minerals, which are being strip mined by these sustaining organizations and somehow colonialist powers. So that's pretty much it. I think the free software has been self-sustaining itself and self-organizing itself for a long period of time. And this self-organization is key to success. And this sustaining problem is not a problem. It's something that actually spoils the whole free and open source software.
Okay, so first question for you. You said we don't need external support to sustain open source development, right?
I'm not saying we don't need external support to sustain open source software development. Okay. I'm saying we may not need that kind of support.
Okay.
In particular, if we're here today, how did we get there, right? This means like for the last 20, 30, 40 years, nothing has been able to sustain itself. We wouldn't be here otherwise. We wouldn't be 10,000 people at FOSDEM today.
Okay. But you still mean, you know, we're taking away like money or taking money from someone else, putting that into open source development, right? That's not necessary. It will work itself out, right? That's the position that I took away. So doesn't that mean that open source development becomes less accessible to just everyone in general, because it also means you need to be able to afford to work on a project that doesn't really properly pay you over time? And I mean, I get why you would make that argument, but how can you justify that?
Well, I think you can make a very simple Darwinist argument, which is if software is not able to sustain itself, if a project is not able to sustain itself, it probably doesn't deserve to be there in the first place. I didn't choose to be on that side of the argument, but I'm doing my best efforts in good faith to actually support this point.
So other than obviously you want to support those who can, you know, survive on their own already, how can you justify that companies are already using open source software to a large extent, right? And at the same time they are developing other software internally, and they are paying their internal developers well, whereas the open source software that they are relying on even more does not get paid equally.
Well, I think there's a simple argument that can be made there. If you're eventually depleting the commons of oxygen by using open source without ever giving back anything, these companies will eventually collapse on themselves. If you were to think about something like the Linux kernel, if nobody was somehow collaborating and contributing to it, their business will companies that rely on Linux to run their business, like banks and large changing, would eventually collapse on their own. So there's an argument that can be made that this would eventually not be in their long-term interest.
So I thank Philippe for that. I'm enjoying these debates. I've never had so much fun being called an extortionist.
I said parasite, not
the skim that pays my salary fortunately brought me here. So Louis will do now the second affirmative side.
And I do want to correct Bradley because he said that Miriam was going to be neutral, and what he meant was aggressively hostile to everyone, which is So big thanks to Miriam for jumping in at the last moment. I want to pick up on two threads from what Mehdi started us with, and those are the importance of independence and the importance of finances in creating a healthy open source. And I think those are intertwined with the sustainability, right? So open source, like the software industry as a whole, is concentrating. Right? We are all at the end of the day, heavily dependent on Microsoft and Amazon and Google to build the things that we want to do. Now, we like our corporate benefactors. Everybody from GitHub here? No, the GitHub folks left? Okay. We hate our corporate benefactors. We need to have, the Google folks are still here, sorry. Sustainability in the context of independence means that we want independence so that communities can be strong and diverse and not dominated by a single player. If the open source community you are in is dominated by a single company or even a small number of companies who all have the same interests, then that is not a sustainable community. And so we need to figure out how we sustain independence within our communities so that they can be the strongest communities. As we've been hearing throughout the day from people who both apparently believe and do not believe it, communities are really important. And, if all open source merely flows uphill to Google and Amazon and the sponsors of the Linux Foundation, what's the outcome of that? Max Sills from Google was here earlier and telling us that open source is about love, which is very nice. And Max occasionally gives me free lunch at their cafeteria. And it's a super healthy lunch, very San Francisco, fresh, organic. So my heart feels good, but then also I have to leave eventually. They throw me out. And they also have a special cafeteria just for employees that you're not allowed to bring friends to, or open source contributors. So, I'm not sure if licensing is the best way to fight for this independence, but I submit that fighting for it is a great idea at the sort of corporate level, right? There's also individual diversity in our communities, right? Getting involved in open source, I want Miriam to be my lawyer. As she was saying, getting involved in open source is an immensely privileged thing. Right? So I got involved in open source while I was in college because I knew that I could dick around and not get great grades in my classes and life would still work out. Right? Or at least I was dumb and young and stupid enough to believe that. Right? And thankfully nobody told my parents. Sorry. I was able to spend a whole lot of time in college that I probably shouldn't have contributing to open source because I had that immense privilege or naivete of believing that it would all work out. We need to focus on sustainability so that open source is a thing that is for all individuals, regardless of their economic privilege or their individual background, not just for the privileged few who are lucky enough to get paid to do it. Which brings us to the second point that Mehdi raised, which is funding. Who here is super excited about capitalism? All right, the Google employee is super excited about capitalism. So we published a blog post on my company blog a little while ago that said essentially, how many of you here have heard of the phrase bus factor in the open source context, right? So for those of you who are not familiar with it, bus factor is the notion of, well, what happens to this community if the leader gets hit by a bus? Right? Which is a sort of grim thing, right? But the core idea is that a healthy community, if the leader gets hit by a bus, everyone will be sad, and then the community will still be able to continue going forward, right? Here's the thing. The good news is, in fact, basically nobody gets hit by a bus. What they get hit by all the time is their bosses. So there's actually some great research from Carnegie Mellon that looked a bunch at GitHub and tried to figure out why did open source projects go unmaintained. And the single biggest cause for open source projects going unmaintained was something at work. So they got laid off. The company switched from Java to Rails because it's 2020 and come on, Java. And where'd Jim go? and then all of a sudden all their Java libraries were abandoned, right? Or their boss said, we were allowing you to do 20% time on open source, but now it's only 10%. And you have to make some tough calls right there. And so that boss factor is really what's one of the most important things in sustainability when we're talking about how do we keep projects sustained over the long term, right? And this conflicts directly, even though it turns out bosses all the time tell people, sorry, you can't work on that open source anymore. By the way, there are now $4 trillion companies in the world, and they are all heavily dependent on open source. Weirdly, the acronym for them is MAGA, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Apple. And when these trillions of dollars of value have been created by open source, doesn't that suggest some solutions to our open source sustainability problem? I'm going to speed through the rest because I only have 1 minute. Working for big companies is fine, right? There's nothing wrong. I do genuinely love my friends at Google, especially when they get me lunch. But if everyone does that, then I would submit to you that open source is not very interesting. An open source that is healthy and vibrant is not going to end up with all of us working at those 4 companies, even though that sometimes looks like the trend right now. So what do we need to do? Well, we should have new licenses that prohibit competition. That's obviously one solution to the sustainability problem, and and I think we also need new economic models, right, where we help individual developers figure out how they can sustainably work on open source. And, are we still clipping or clapping? I can't. 5 seconds. We need new economic models. Yay!
So you talked about the mega companies, right?
Right.
Yet you still want to put the developers in charge of making sure the open source community is sustained, or the communities are sustained over time. Why don't you put it on those who actually use it most?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for giving me that opportunity to talk about new economic models. I think that we need to, what we currently do is we beg those companies for charity, right? We say, oh, please buy us dinner, please fund our conference, please fund Conservancy. You should all fund Conservancy. But when we rely on guilt as the model as opposed to return on investments, that's not very sustainable, right? It means they can roll out of bed one day and say, hey, you know what, actually I don't feel so guilty anymore. Karen's just not quite so effective in making me feel bad today. So, so we're going to drop a 0 off that check. Like, that's not a way to build true sustainability. That's a charitable model that still leaves us at the mercy of the billionaires who run these companies. So it's definitely not developer-centric if we don't have an economic model.
Okay, second question. Now, you get someone to pay for the sustainability, right? You get the guilt factor is still okay, right? And then you go ahead because you have the projects making sure sustainability is present, and then you take money away from that and don't pay all of the money that you actually get in to the developers. How is that fair?
I think somebody said something about a 20% skim earlier, and the Apple standard is a 30% skim, and we should aspire to be every bit as good as Apple. I think that part of the way we're going to build look, this already happens, right? The Linux Foundation is the biggest sustainability player. By the way, they don't employ any engineers. And actually, some of that is okay, right? Employing salespeople, employing people who help with infrastructure and documentation.
I'm an engineer.
Okay. All right. Okay. I was told just yesterday by a Linux Foundation employee that they proudly did not employ any engineers. I apologize. But I think the general point still stands, which is that most of the Linux Foundation sub-projects focus on higher level governance, infrastructure, and you know what? Those things are valuable. Those are part of sustainability. Thank you.
So Marc Jones will do the final negative. Sorry, I lost track of where I am. And then we'll have cross-examination for that, and then they're doing no final rebuttals, so we'll have audience questions after that. So go ahead, Marc.
Am I allowed to disclaim the disclaimer? Is it okay if
Yes,
I believe most of what I say?
in my debate, so yes, you may.
I think most of what I'm about to say I actually believe, or at least I'll believe for, like, I don't know, the rest of today. So if you want to hold me to it, that's fine. So I think really the problem here is that the affirmative side is presupposing that there is a sustainability problem, right? And there might be a sustainability problem from a business perspective, but the reality is that the reason why this conference is so big, the reason why businesses care so much about free software is that we have a lot of it. We made a lot of it in the last 30, 40 years. We don't actually have a sustainability problem. It might not be working the way that everyone wants it to work. Maybe it's not optimized for some businesses. Maybe it's not optimized for some businesses Lewis might run. I figured, since we're going personal. By the way, the word was symbiotic, right? Not parasitic. That was what you were trying to defend yourself as. But we don't have to, the free software community shouldn't have to change how it operates to accommodate other people. We shouldn't have to compromise our principles as people believe in free software just because it's more convenient for other people. If businesses want to take advantage of the great benefit that free software is successfully creating and has been doing for a while, and there's no reason to think it's going to stop tomorrow. In fact, we're probably going to need even more of it. They should learn how to use free software. They should learn how to work with free software the way free software works. Free software doesn't need big business. Big businesses need free software. Lewis is right. The MAGA companies were built off of free software. So maybe they should figure out how they can make even more money by figuring out how we actually work, how we produce this free software, instead of asking us to change, to be more convenient, to fit into their corporate structures. Maybe it's okay that we're right about one more thing, right? We were right about the licenses. We were right about how to build software. Maybe we're right about how businesses should work too, right? Maybe we're right about how businesses should treat other people, and that this is a lesson that we can teach them. I've so gone off my notes at this point. Oh, yes, the important thing. So you'll notice if you look at the webpage describing this debate, one of the things we were supposed to talk about was the sustainable license that have come out of last year. And I didn't hear a lot of defense from it. But the reality is, right, part of the reason we're talking about sustainability is because businesses want there to be a crisis so they can justify forcing people into using, let's face it, our proprietary licenses, right? The SSPL, really good shot at it. And maybe there is a world where you can convince me, these facts are there, but it's not a free software license. And, even if you can make some technical argument, it's completely disingenuous to say that you support the free software community when you're putting that license out there. These licenses were created because it's better for business and the way they are operating, right? They built their businesses off the free software community. They went out to their customers and said that they're selling a free software product because free software is cool, and their customers know it's cool, and they wanted the extra branding that came with being free software producers. And now that they're successful and that their VC fund backers want to cash out, they're trying to figure out, well, how do we maximize the amount of profit that we can get? And their answer is, let's just pretend that there's a sustainability crisis, and that the only way that we can keep being successful free software companies is to stop being free software companies. And we'll just convince everyone making free software that that's true. That if they want to continue to make free software, right? Who here in this room thinks that they need money to go write code for an hour? They don't, right? If you have a passion for it, if you have a reason for it, you can go write code. It's one of the great things about our movement. It democratizes it. We don't need permission from large companies. We don't need their salaries to do it. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't get paid a salary to produce software. You absolutely should. My salary is paid with free software because there are business models that work with the free software ethos, work with the community, and we don't go out and ask the communities we work with to change how they're operating with. We're okay with that when we figured out how to take advantage of free software the way it is without asking free software to compromise. Oh, well, I didn't prepare enough notes. Corporate homes. This is another, the idea that all projects need to go into some kind of nonprofit home or for-profit home, that's not the reality of it. Now, some of them might be parasitic. Maybe there is a military-industrial complex. I'm not going to name who's in it, but they have their purpose for it. But we already have those models, right? The projects that makes sense for, and there are a lot of them, can go to those homes. We don't need to create new kinds of it. We certainly don't need to force every project into it, even if it's convenient for some businesses. Yeah, it might be easier for some businesses to go say, oh, well, I really, really, really want an exception. So it would be great if you can go find a corporation and a board of directors so you can have a boss who will tell you, like, oh, all we have to do is centralize our copyright so you can give an exception because it's really, really important for this one person that they don't have to follow the license. But a lot of projects are fine just being projects. The motivations for creating that project might not be to satisfy every business's whim. It might be because they have something else. Maybe they're using it for a side business. Maybe they're using it as part of a larger business model. Maybe it's a hobbyist project. We don't need to find homes for all these projects in some kind of legal structure. And we know that because these projects existed. Right? If the project didn't exist, oh, maybe we have to think about that. But you don't tell me that a project has existed for a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years without some kind of corporate master needs a corporate master to continue to exist in the future. I'm going to reserve the balance of my time.
Okay, so currently sustainability is, well, not an obligation, but it's more like a charity thing that companies can do or users can do if they want to, right? Now, if you say companies are at the same time, or many developments, right, are depending to a large extent on free and open source software, shouldn't everyone who's using open source software really care about sustainability? Because if what Louis said is true, and there is what was it called? Buzz factor, sorry, yes. And there is a buzz factor. Isn't there a threat that you just use the basis of your development at any time unless you care about sustainability?
Yeah, that sounds like a business problem. I mean, and that's kind of my point.
Which is what you're in favor of, right?
No. That's my point. Is that if businesses are worried about the sustainability of free software, they shouldn't ask free software to change. They're getting a gift from the free software community. They took advantage of that gift. They now realize that they've created a dependency on it because they're being competitive in the marketplace relies on it. So what they need to do is they need to figure out how to work with the free software community. It's not a sustainability topic for the free software community. It's a sustainability problem for corporations who've chosen to be dependent upon it.
Yeah, but isn't that the same thing then? Doesn't that then necessarily mean that you need to ensure you keep that alive, you keep alive what you're depending on? And isn't that exactly what this is about?
For the businesses, and that's what I'm saying, but the business, why do we care if the business succeeds? I would be perfectly happy if all of the proprietary software companies went out of business and were replaced with free software companies without having to compromise the ethical values in the community, without having to draft new licenses that are clearly not free software licenses.
That doesn't uphold every single project, though. That doesn't ensure sustainability for all projects.
No, and that's one of the great things. That's one of the reasons that capitalism works, right? That's one of the things that makes free software work, is that not everything deserves to survive, right? Like some things are going to fail, and that's okay. Actually, I think free software encourages that, right?
Last question. So if it's not sustainability, like proposed here, what's your solution? How do you make sure
I'm still trying to figure out what the problem is, because I think the real problem here is that people are pretending there's a problem around sustainability.
If we do this next year, I think Miriam just got herself recruited as the permanent cross-examiner all day, so she may regret that. And I want to thank her for doing that. Again, I want to mention the panelists agreed to forego their rebuttals, so that the audience can ask questions. You're welcome to ask questions of either side or both. Or Miriam. And I asked the panelists to share. I apologize, we only have 2 mics. That's the FOSDEM setup. So please be fair to each other, each side with the mic that you have there.
No questions? That's the end of the day. I've got a question.
In the one of the panelists said that if you've got an hour, you can always do open source. You can always write code, which is true. Some of the things that's necessary to make a successful community maybe take a bit longer than an hour, maybe do need skills that aren't available. How can we help companies sustain communities with things other than just the code contributions?
Is that question directed at anyone in particular? All right.
You were the one who said we could do it in an hour.
Yeah, we can do everything in an hour. No, I think that's a great question, right? And I think the answer is that companies really should find out how successful free software projects have worked and make it part of their employees' jobs officially, not just an extra 20% time where, yeah, you could go, volunteer at a nonprofit or you can work on a free software project. If the company's really built off of free software, then make that your business model and pay your developers to write free software as their full-time job. Like, there are ways of making that work. Just don't expect free software developers who don't work for you to adjust to your corporate business model. We're staying in character, right?
Yeah, to answer your question, let's retake the comparison with the environment, right? Everybody can have an hour to go clean the street or make something good for the planet. Who does it more than 1 hour, 2 hours, 10 hours? It needs to be managed, right? At some point, the society, every commons needs to be managed, right? So this is a dream that hobbyists can change the world only themselves if they're not organized.
And I'd add that the problem is not businesses changing their model, it's the people, right? Like, it's not, the businesses think that, oh, I switched from Java to Rails and so now you're doing Rails instead of Java. That's fine. The person who's forced to walk away from his Java community because now it's his weekend time and he has kids and so he doesn't do weekend time. And so that Java community breaks apart because his boss has made a decision. The business model for the company is fine. It's the model for the human being and the community around that human being that has failed.
So I've got a question for Luis, right here. Did I understand you correctly that you're agreeing with Marc that maybe licenses aren't the right vehicle to support sustainability?
I'm staying in character. So yes, licenses are totally a great way to support sustainability. I think that, as I also in character said in the previous talk, I think that there's probably some experimentation to be had there in a healthy way, and I think there's probably a bit, at least in some cases, somewhat less skepticism is warranted, right? Like, I see a lot of, in the case of the cryptographic autonomy license, yes, it is a company pushing this thing, but it is also a thing that very clearly and very explicitly is about data, right? And everyone said, oh no, you're just a company trying to make sure that nobody else is ever using the thing. It's like, well, actually, they seem to be as best as I can. I mean, yes, it's a company, but it's also a company that seems to want users to actually have access to data. And so why are we so hyper aggressively skeptical when this is an attempt by a company, as Marc was saying, this is an attempt by a company to actually adopt free software principles in, I think, the healthiest of ways. And we've basically told them that they're, well, not we collectively, but some of us have told the sponsors of that license that they're bad people, which I find unsupported by the evidence. And I'm not just saying that because there are lawyers around here somewhere.
So, Louis, you can stay in your character by saying that does FOSS need sustainability? Yes, but not with license. You can stay in character, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's true, right? Like, I think the bottom line is, to both stay in character and to be completely honest here, right? It frustrates me when people say that the entire sustainability problem is a corporate problem, when I have friends who don't attend FOSDEM anymore because they got burnt out, right? They were expected to do things on weekends. They were expected to do things when they could be spending time with their kids. So they don't do open source anymore, right? And to say, oh, this is a business model problem, some of it is a business model problem, but a lot of it is also a very deeply human problem. And so to throw the English phrase is throw the baby out with the bathwater. So yeah, I don't like the SSP, getting a little out of character here or somewhere in between. I don't really like the SSPL, but to say there's no sustainability problem because you don't like the SSPL is to confuse two related but distinct things.
Okay, I have a question. This is coming from the OpenStreetMap space where we rely on volunteer mappers and a lot of paid contributors through a lot of companies are doing mapping. So what happens in your community when you started as a volunteer project and then some corporate contributors come in and they start to do a lot of the maintenance and contribution? And I guess this would be a question for you, Marc, is it? How sustainable can your community remain when that influence is still exerting itself and you can't just say, go do your own thing or listen to us?
So really, it's when you've gotten the influx of money from a large corporate contributor and you've grown to a certain size.
If you have co-contributors.
Just resources. Staying in character and honestly too. For nonprofits, like that really is a problem. And actually for profits as well, right? How do you manage your growth, right? It's probably I think, depending upon what you're doing, it's hard for for-profits to say, oh, we grew too quickly. We regret that. Although sometimes they do. I think it's a lot more real for nonprofits because you really can collapse underneath your own weight if you grow too quickly, especially if resources showed up and then they suddenly disappeared and you just kind of counted on it. And it's managing that. And I think that's a challenge for all nonprofits, regardless of what they're doing, right? It's not just the free software problem. If you're a nonprofit and you suddenly get an influx of volunteers, you have to ask, how dependent do you want to become on them and manage their contributions so that if they do suddenly disappear one day, you either have a way of replacing those resources or you have a way of scaling back down.
And can I add also in character, but also again, honestly, if you're thinking about it helps to think about these things, I find, in a sustainability frame, because if money just drops from the sky, it can be and you're just like, great, money. That can be, as Marc said, very disruptive. Whereas if you think about it in terms of how are we building capacity, how are we building human capability in the long run, which is in part organizational and financial, but it's a big fractal thing. And if you just treat it as as you know from the OpenStreetMap community, right? It's not just yay, it's millions more map data points, but that is a super two-edged sword, right? Fractally edged sword, is that a thing?
Just to the point, which is too much money can really spoil things. And I know of a few open source projects which are somewhat good at seeking funds and funding, which have been basically funded and receiving grants several times for the same code. That's, when there's a lot of money, eventually that generates this kind of behaviors. So it's really something which can spoil the community and the originally volunteer and generous gift of code that was made in the first place.
Hi, gentlemen. So first of all, I want to thank the fine folks who have been running the microphones up and down all day. I know we've had a host of characters doing that, and I'm very grateful. So thank you to everyone for doing that. So I have two questions, but the first one is a show of hands, so it's super fast. How many of the folks up in the front of the room have done research into prior art in sustainability, such as the Brundtland Report and the corporate sustainability movement back in the 1980s? Just show of hands. One. Excellent. That is 25% more than I normally find. So question number two, you've spent the last nearly 50 minutes up there talking about sustainability, and I haven't yet heard anyone define what they mean on either side by sustainability. Could each side please do that for us? Just to see whether you're even talking about the same thing.
In character.
So in character, sustainability means finding all the technical, financial, human, and let's say, and philosophical means to accomplish your fate. Right? So that's sustainability, what you want really to deliver.
I think we are taking the idea of sustainability from perspective, the continued production of free software.
Yeah, and in character, I don't subscribe to the existence of sustainability.
So this question's for Louis. Conservancy, for example, has we estimate something, we in our member projects have about 5,000 volunteers, we estimate. And we pay about 120 contractors per year for software engineering work. What should we be doing differently? Why, what is not sustainable about that?
So I actually think that that's a pretty, that feels to me like a reasonably healthy ratio, right? Like, to me, part of the sustainability puzzle is how you balance that ratio of paid people often doing infrastructure work, often doing work that enables other people to do long-term things, with healthy volunteerism, right? Because the most sustainable long-term communities are those communities that have that blend, right? That have people who can do some of the occasionally boring but necessary stuff, right? For example, I got my professional start in open source being, it's a little bit of a gross oversimplification, but Sun indirectly was paying me to do bug tracking work in the GNOME project so that we could get GNOME 2.0 out the door. That was not something that people in the community were like chomping at the bit to like, oh, I just want to sit in front of the bug tracker all day, right? I'm weird. I actually did want to do that, and then somebody paid me to do it. And critically, I also built a community around, actually probably in a ratio fairly similar of one paid person to 20, 30, 40 at different times volunteers, many of whom went on to careers in open source, who were helping get that release out the door by understanding the QA, right? So if you were to tell me, yeah, I'm paying 4,900 of those 5,000 people, which is the ratio in some communities, communities in quotes, that's not very sustainable, right? Because when the companies involved decide, as in fact in the longer run happened to GNOME, GNOME had a very long, hard period when its corporate sponsors, and the reason that GNOME has continued to sustain is because it did have, I think better than a lot of communities, had a healthy community around those corporate contributions, right? So you want to be able to do both, right? And that ratio, like honestly, not just an in-character thing, sounds to me like a pretty healthy one. And I'm sure that you have individual projects within that where there's really only one or two people and they're all paid, or there's, maybe not, right? Just numeric, like the odds are, but if not, even better, right?
So
oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's quickly on my side.
So just saying that Louis just conceded that his kind of sustainability carries the seeds of the demise of some of the project he wants to help being sustained.
No, I would just say, to refer to your previous question, being sustainable is not only surviving, right? Being sustainable is achieving the goals you set to yourself. And I would just answer, if you're, as a free software conservancy, your fate is to have 5,000 contributors, pay 120 contractors, and it's enough to define your sustainability, you're sustainable. If it's 100,000 volunteers with, 2,000 contractors, you're not yet sustainable. It's just the fate you want to apply to yourself that define your sustainability model. So surviving is not just being sustainable. For some people, unfortunately, it is. But for some people who have the chance to have better goals, your sustainability needs to match these goals, right?
I mean, if I can be super in character here, sustainability is getting a Lambo. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
So we're at the end of the session. We've been doing questions at the end of each debate rather than declaring a winner. How many people learned something about this issue they didn't know before they came in here during this debate? More than half the audience. That's wonderful. How many of you have changed your position or views on the issue of FOSS sustainability because of this debate? Wow. Yeah. So 6 or 7 people in the audience have changed their position. Before we finish this particular one, do any of you want to state, like, come out of character and say, like a more aggressive disclaimer or anything?
In 15 seconds.
Yeah, just very quickly. Yeah.
Let's own it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's own it.
Yeah. I was hoping.